presenter Melissa Bernstein. Welcome, everyone. Melissa, next slide. Dr. Melissa Bernstein is here at Rady Children's Hospital, San Diego. She is the Director of Advancing California's Trauma-Informed Systems, or ACTS, and the Trauma-Informed Licensing Team Initiative. Her research centers around supporting systems and planning for, implementing, and sustaining trauma-informed change. Dr. Melissa Bernstein, we're very glad to have you.
Thanks so much, Dina, for that lovely introduction. I'm really excited to be here presenting on this topic with all of you today. So dealing with behavior problems is pretty challenging enough on its own, but adding the element of trauma can make it that much more difficult. So I'm going to be sharing some evidence-based approaches and techniques to managing challenging behavior in kiddos who have been exposed to trauma. I'm going to use the word caregiver throughout the presentation. This refers to biological caregivers, resource or foster caregivers, kinship caregivers, really anyone that's caring for the child or youth. The topic is pretty information heavy, I find, so I really invite you all to ask questions in that Q&A throughout the presentation. I'm going to try and engage the chat as much as possible. I'll try and pause and ask for questions as we go, but hopefully we'll have some time at the end as well. Okay, so in our time together today, I'll be talking a little bit about the impact of trauma on parenting, trying to figure out what is going on, thinking about assessment for these challenging behaviors, talking a lot about the importance of relationships when we're talking about challenging behaviors in kids who've been exposed to trauma, and then finally going into some strategies to shape behavior. Okay, so before we dive in, I know it's a big group on the call, but thinking about school-age kiddos, and when we say school age, we're thinking about kids ages 6 to 12 or around that age, give or take a little bit. I'm thinking about the families you work with. What are some of the behaviors that caregivers come to you with the most? So what are those like the most kind of challenging behaviors that you hear that you work with your families around? So I see anger is one of those. Absolutely, that's definitely a popular anger outburst, depression, defiance, aggression, distraction, some more aggressive behavior, lying and stealing, feeling closed off. So those trauma-related symptoms, you guys are coming in quick, I love it. Fighting, tantrums, not listening, right, that disobedience, not listening to directions. Great, so we see 0 to 100 in seconds, so we'll definitely talk a little bit about that today. Lack of trust, profanity, tantrums, absolutely. So, okay, great. We're all here for the right presentation. This is what we're going to be talking about today. These are the behaviors that we can keep in mind. We're talking about some of these strategies. Okay, so we really can't talk about challenging behaviors, especially in school-age kiddos, without talking about caregivers. Right, so like a 7-year-old is not going to solve their own emotional dysregulation problems, right? So a big piece of shaping challenging behavior in school-age kids is going to revolve around caregivers. So we'll spend some time talking about this in the beginning. Okay, so there have been decades and decades of research on child development and attachment, which is really this relationship between children and caregivers. And what the literature overwhelmingly shows is that children with what we call a secure attachment to their caregivers, these are kids who have this kind of balanced parenting style with this nurturing interactions, warm, loving, kind attention, balanced with appropriate limits, rules, boundaries, things like that. And when we see this kind of balance for kids, and we see the secure attachment, we see them really thrive in their relationships, in their self-esteem, in their understanding of their emotions and their regulations. And so when we look at this caregiver-child relationship with a secure attachment, we're really looking for this kind of important balance. So what can happen after a trauma, right? After difficult things happen to kids and families, this balance can really be thrown off, right? We know that trauma has such a significant impact on kids, but it also really affects the families at large and the caregivers themselves. So one thing we might see from caregivers after trauma is this high level of nurturing and low level of limits. So lots of warmth, caring, attention, all of that good stuff. Rules kind of out the window, low level of limits. So I just want to throw it to you all. How do you think this kind of balance might impact kids? Get a high level of nurturing, kind of low limits. How might that impact kiddos? Might be confusing for them. Absolutely. So they're in our world, there are a ton of rules. In school, there are a ton of rules. And now all of a sudden at home, like that goes out the window. That can be kind of confusing. Absolutely. Get them to appear to be spoiled, right? So they just want to get their way because they get their way all the time, maybe at home if there are no rules. All behavior is okay, right? So we don't really get to learn about what, where is that line? What is okay and what isn't okay? Absolutely. May lead to manipulation. And Emilio, I'm glad you brought that up, and we will come back to this word manipulation later as well. Maybe some arguing, not learning about authority, absolutely. So there's a lot of research on this, and it shows that this imbalance can sometimes lead to poor emotion regulation, being rebellious, defiant, all the things that you guys were mentioning. And when I work with caregivers, some of the thoughts that they shared with me around, when we see this imbalance, especially after trauma, is, from maybe a resource caregiver, this child just needs this unconditional love because this wasn't shown to them, and so I'm going to show it to them. And I'm not gonna worry about rules or anything like that. We're just going to focus on this relationship. And sometimes you'll hear from birth parents or birth caregivers, maybe there's a little bit of guilt there, or feeling bad that child got hurt. So it's okay if we don't do our homework on time, or it's okay if we just loosen those rules, right? And so I think it's helpful for us as helping professionals who work with caregivers to start to understand how their thinking and feeling is impacted by trauma so that we can better understand and empathize when we see a bit of this imbalance and align with them to teach some new strategies. Great. Okay, so we also see the opposite as well, in the opposite direction, high level of limits, rules, and low level of nurturing. So love to check in with you all. How might you think this impacts kids when we see this kind of balance, or imbalance, I should say? So it may lead to feeling abandonment, so not feeling cared for, low self-esteem, absolutely. A lot of the research shows that when there are high level of limits and high demands and that low level of nurturing, we do see a lot of that feeling of low self-esteem, a lot of that anxiety and insecurity, absolutely. And so some common thoughts here, again, are, this child maybe hasn't had discipline before, we need, extreme discipline, or structure is the most important thing, I wasn't using it before, it's lacking, whatever those thoughts may be. Again, helpful to start to understand and align with caregivers around how they've been impacted after the trauma and how that's changed or shaped their parenting behaviors. So today we're going to spend some time learning about ways to keep this kind of scales balanced. We'll talk about skills around limits and consequences, but equally important, we're also going to be talking around skills around nurturing and connection. Okay, so now we're going to dive a little bit into what behaviors look like when kids are having a trauma response. All right, so we're all probably pretty familiar with the fight, flight, freeze. I think it's something we hear often. It's our body's alarm system, right? It's what, tells us how to react when we meet that bear in the woods. So after a trauma, this alarm system in our bodies is kind of broken, right? The alarm will go off over seemingly innocuous things, even though there's no real danger around. It could be someone raised their voice or bumped into that child, or it could be they were eating an ice cream flavor, right? We really kind of don't know what those triggers might be. And so even though that bump on the playground was an accident, that child's alarm system kind of kicked into survival mode, and now they're in fight, flight, and freeze mode, right? And when we're in that mode, we're thinking from the real kind of base of our brain, the survival mode, our executive function skills, our problem solving, they're kind of offline. It's not happening, right? And I think this is probably, I know this isn't a presentation on child trauma and understanding it, but I think this is such an important concept to help caregivers teachers, anyone really working with kiddos help understand, because the behaviors that we're seeing from these kiddos are not necessarily intentional, right? They're not necessarily malicious or manipulative, right? They might be a result of that child's broken alarm system, trying to keep them safe, right? It needed to kick in when they were in danger, when they were being hurt or harmed, and it was very helpful. And what happens is that broken alarm system is still going off even though there's no danger. So sometimes it can be helpful to kind of switch our mindset and help caregivers understand that when we see these behaviors, it might be there's broken alarm system or a trauma response. And it can help us to think about how we can respond in a more trauma-informed way. Okay, so what does this look like? How can we tell if a kiddo is in this kind of fight, flight, freeze, if this broken alarm system is going off? I will just say a caveat that it is kind of hard to tell. This isn't a one-to-one science. It can be tricky. Sometimes this can just be general misbehavior, but for the most part, I think these are really helpful clues to let us know that maybe this is real dysregulation, that this child is stuck in this fight, flight, freeze mode. So what that looks like is these extreme emotions, right? All of a sudden, these kind of big feelings pop up. The behavior feels like it's out of the blue. Oftentimes, like I hear caregivers say, like, where is this coming from? It's a big response over maybe a minor issue. It happens quickly. We talk about that 0 to 60 feeling. The child is unable to calm down. So we see a lot of that kind of dysregulation, that out of control feeling. When we try to engage, it just makes it worse. It does not respond to reasoning. That does not help. Again, if we remember, when we're in that fight, flight, freeze mode, when we're super dysregulated, we're using that survival brain, the thinking part of our brain, if you will, if I could simplify it, is kind of offline. So reasoning isn't helping. The distress may last a long time. And then this feeling of being dysregulated and out of control isn't a great feeling for kids or adults for that matter. And so sometimes what we see after is kids being apologetic or kind of feeling a bit ashamed of that behavior. Okay, so what do we do? I think this is maybe one of the most important slides in the slide deck because it's not easy to deal with these large, big reactions. It's hard for caregivers. It's hard for caregivers to see their kiddos experiencing this. And so this can be helpful to kind of walk through and talk through with caregivers around how to respond when you are seeing that kind of out of control trauma response behavior. So the first thing we can do is create, as much as we can, a sense of safety, right? So starting to stand a few feet away from that child, giving them that space, starting to regulate the environment, speaking in a calm and quiet tone can be really helpful. We can briefly reflect on the emotion. So telling that child, I know you're feeling upset. I can see you're having big feelings. I'm here if you need me. You can offer to do a favorite coping skill together. Sometimes that's too much, right? If you engage and you see that dysregulation come up, it's another time to, step back. This is where a caregiver, especially for school age kids, can start to model some of those coping skills. So starting to model, standing kind of far away, remaining calm, modeling deep breathing can be really helpful. And then allowing that child time to calm down. There will be a time to talk about the behavior and talk about the big feelings that came up, but it's not going to be in that moment, right? It's going to be once that child decreases that arousal and is out of that fight, flight, freeze kind of state, right? So allowing that child to calm down can look like, again, backing away and being quiet, right? The less language, the better during these moments. But caregivers can also stay close to that child or youth so that they can get that attention and affection when they need it. So sounds simple, maybe it doesn't, but it is not easy. I think caregivers do need support in trying this out. It can sound simple, but in the moment when those big behaviors are happening, it can be really triggering for caregivers themselves. So working with caregivers, I'm thinking, what kind of coping thoughts can you have during this time, right? So coming up with a thought when you're backing away that helps you remain calm as a caregiver, having them practice their own breathing first and getting their own emotions in check. Again, easier said than done at times, but this can be really helpful to help limit the escalation of those trauma responses. Okay, so with a lot of these skills, I've tried to provide some handouts to support us working with caregivers around these skills. So the first handout is called Coaching on Coping Skills. It's a really nice handout I use with caregivers a lot. It goes over what the behaviors after trauma can look like. So those things I just talked about, and then reminds and reinforces ways caregivers can take care of themselves and then respond to that behavior. I always like to include a handout on effective treatments to give to caregivers as well. And thanks for dropping those links in the chat. Okay, so we're going to just spend a little bit of time talking about misbehavior and how it could look a little bit different. So when we're talking about just general behavior problems, again, just to think about the difference between when we see those trauma reactions and just general misbehavior. General misbehavior are typically can look like defiance or oppositionality. They're maintained by rewards in the environment. So whenever Maria starts to yell, Mom gives the iPad. So if I'm Maria, I'm probably going to yell to get my iPad, right? So they're maintained by rewards in the environment. That means they also respond to rewards in the environment. So what we see with general behavior problems are in the moment, they typically respond really well to some of the behavior management strategies we'll be talking about. Whereas that trauma response, not so much. These kind of general behavior problems are often created and reinforced through maybe inconsistency or leniency or unpredictability. So if I hit my brother and sometimes I go to timeout, but sometimes I don't, maybe I'll roll the dice and see what happens, right? Again, these are things that kind of maintain behavior problems, but don't necessarily maintain these trauma responses. Okay. All right, so I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about assessment and trying to figure out what's going on. I think one of the first steps for us in helping caregivers manage challenging behavior is having a really good understanding of what's going on. And so this is a skill I think caregivers can use this with their kiddos, but I find it to be really helpful as just a helping professional trying to help caregivers with these difficult behaviors. So we're just going to talk about one assessment strategy. It might be familiar to you guys. It's the ABCs of behavior. So this is where we really try and understand what's going on and why is it happening. So the B stands for behavior. What I often hear from caregivers is my child's acting crazy, or they're off the wall or out of control. And as a helping professional, I don't really know what to do with that, what to do with crazy. So I need more information, right? So our first step is to help caregivers really define that behavior, which is going to be helpful for themselves as well. So Thomas is hitting his sister. Okay, got it. I can do something with that. Lisa won't stay in her room after lights out. Okay, that's what we're going to be working on. So it's really, really helpful to kind of narrow down which behavior we're talking about. Sometimes when there's a lot going on, especially after a trauma, there can be a lot of dysregulation. It's helpful. A question I ask that I find to be helpful is if you had a magic wand and you can change one behavior in your home, what would it be? Okay, we're going to start here. We're going to start small. We're going to start with one thing. So that first piece is understanding the behavior. A second piece is figuring out what happened before that behavior. Fancy word for that is antecedents. So for example, you might, or one example that I've had with caregivers is that, you know, I'm working with a caregiver and they shared with me that their kiddo was pushing kids at the bus stop, getting into fights. And so I want to know what's happening before that behavior starts. Did anything happen that morning? Are any triggers happening or activated? Again, we won't always know, but it's helpful for kids with trauma to check in when we're seeing these big behaviors. Potentially, it could be a date that is triggering, a date around when the trauma occurred. It could be that, you know, there was yelling happening and yelling is a trigger and we know that for that kiddo. Again, we can't know all of the triggers because it's very unique for each child and very unique to the experience they had. But it's always helpful to check in when we see these big behaviors, try and figure out what's going on and if there were any triggers. Okay, so figuring out what happened before. So with this kiddo who was fighting at the bus stop, I asked what had happened that morning, and she had shared that her dad usually drives her, but they're getting a divorce. And so she started to have to take the bus. There were big feelings around that divorce that's happening. And that's really helpful for me because now I know I'm not just dealing with the hitting, but we're also dealing with this larger kind of big feelings around divorce. Okay, and the last piece when we're thinking about this assessment is consequences. So what happened after the behavior, right? So if every time Joey is sent home from school, he goes to work with mom, if he loves going to work with mom, maybe that's reinforcing. Okay, here's an easy, not easy, but maybe a quicker fix for this. So again, we really want to get a sense of what is the behavior, what's going on before, what's going on after. Okay. So this is just a helpful kind of cheat sheet, I think, for us to go over with caregivers. These are questions that we can ask. And then I think as caregivers get really savvy, they can start to think about these questions for themselves as well. Again, it has questions around the behavior. I want to learn all about it. Paint me a picture. Questions to ask what happened before, what led up to it, and questions around what happened after. What did you do? What was said? Okay. So we're going to stick on this topic of caregivers a little bit longer. One of the first steps in behavior management is really building relationships, not only between the child and the caregiver, which we'll talk about, but also between us as a helping professional and the caregiver. We're really not going to get very far with caregivers if they don't feel like we truly understand the situation. So just love to hear from you all. What are some challenges you experience in working with caregivers around difficult behaviors? I know there's probably a lot and it can be pretty long, but if you can just think about like the biggest one, some challenges you experience when you're trying to either teach behavior management or when you're working with them around challenging behaviors. So a lack of patience, absolutely. I'm coming in and saying my kiddo is out of control and you're telling me that like I need to work on things, like that is tough. And also, I've been dealing with this for a long time now and I'm out of patience, right? Like I'm just at my wit's end. And that can be really hard to try something new when we're at our wit's end. Yeah, caregivers are tired themselves. Again, now we're asking them to do all these things. That can be really tough. Caregivers taking behaviors personally, absolutely. We'll talk about that in a little too. When we take things personally, it's pretty hard for us to stay regulated and to try and work on those behaviors. So that's absolutely a thing we want to address. Lack of follow through. This stuff isn't easy. It's, all the skills we'll go over aren't necessarily rocket science, but it's that consistency. And when, a child has just experienced a trauma or in a home with a lot of dysregulation, it can be so hard to be consistent. I tried it and that doesn't work. So I think that's the most common thing. Anytime I do a behavior chart or try to use any of these strategies, like doesn't work, tried it a million times. We'll talk about this, but something helpful that I do sometimes with that one is as parents, I totally understand that. I get that. Can I share with you some strategies that other parents have found helpful? But that's definitely one of those kind of barriers in the beginning. Some denial, right? That can happen. So when they don't really understand or accept that there's difficult behaviors happening. Absolutely, these are great examples. There's too many to read through, but I think you guys nailed a lot of the big ones here. Feeling overwhelmed. Maybe there's more training needed. So a skills gap, so they don't know what they don't know, right? And then I think the theme I'm hearing a lot is caregivers are overwhelmed and checked out. And we need to understand that as well. I think sometimes it's we want to jump right into giving suggestions and giving recommendations, but the reason we're talking about this now is it's so important to open up the space for caregivers to share these frustrations that they're having. Okay. I will just say, I just see Tiffany's comment, their own unresolved trauma, and absolutely, a lot of the times we know that trauma can be intergenerational, and that for kids who've experienced trauma, there's high levels of rates of trauma in caregivers as well. And so if we have the opportunity spending time to talking about how this is triggering their own trauma and what they're doing to take care of themselves so that they can better take care of their kiddo. Okay, so all this said, let's talk about how we can collaborate and connect and align with our caregivers. So I think the first thing is what we've all just did together is really creating the space to share concerns. I think without doing this, we really do ourselves a disservice. I want to hear all these things that you just shared. I want to hear that I'm tired. I don't have patience. I've tried this a million times. It doesn't work. I think when we don't hear that and we just dive into giving suggestions, they're kind of already over that, right? And so we want to create this space for hearing those unpopular thoughts. And we also want to spend time normalizing that. Like, absolutely, I totally understand that this is how you feel. You're not alone in having these thoughts and feelings, right? Because it can feel isolating for some caregivers. And then we want to spend time aligning with that caregiver. And I think this is, one of those easy things we say, but it can be really tough. If some caregivers are coming to us in denial that nothing's going on, it's easy for us to say, okay, you know what, then I can't, how am I going to help you? So I think it takes some time on our end to recognize that, again, trauma has impacts not just on that child, but on that caregiver as well, right? Someone mentioned that their own trauma, they might be having some triggered feelings. So taking our own time to just reflect and try, if we're noticing that we're not empathizing and we're not relating to that caregiver, how can I try and put my own trauma-informed hat on and think about how they might be experiencing the aftermath of that child's trauma and these challenging behaviors that are happening. And then am I communicating a message of hope? So again, sometimes I share with caregivers that children who experience trauma learned ways to keep themselves safe that are no longer serving them, but those were learned behaviors, which means they can be unlearned. So there's hope here. And so it's kind of our job, again, to help create that hope so that we can try some of these kind of behavioral strategies out. Okay. So again, I thank you all from all of your comments. We need this buy-in for behavior management. The first thing we want to do is check on those assumptions. You guys already named some. I'll just go over a couple more. A big thing is that caregivers need accurate trauma-informed information and understanding of those child behaviors. So let's go over a couple of those common misunderstandings. So one of them, and feel free to share some others in the chat if you would like. These are the ones I see the most. So things like, my kiddo's a pathological liar, or they're not upset unless they're caught, they have no remorse. So I hear that often. And again, we're thinking about school-age children. And so we want to keep in mind, like, what's developmentally appropriate. We know for some kids in this age range, they're just learning how to lie and they're learning how to get their way. And some of that is normative. Probably a 7-year-old is not going to be this pathological liar. So how do we help caregivers understand what's developmentally appropriate for those kids so we can start to shift those expectations? Someone mentioned already this over-personalization, right? Like, the child's doing this to get at me, the child's disrespecting me. So that's a really helpful time, again, to try and provide some information around child trauma and what happens after trauma and where these behaviors might come from, that it's not necessarily against you, right? And how do we shift those thoughts for caregivers? So if I think in my head, this child is doing this to get at me, I'm probably going to respond pretty harshly, right? But if I'm shifting my thinking and thinking, okay, I know this isn't personal. This, my kiddo is having problems with their emotions and regulating their emotions. I'm here to help, right? It's going to totally change the way I react. And then the last one is pathologizing that behavior. So we hear the word manipulative a lot and that they just have attachment issues. We just want to be a little bit careful. Again, keeping our trauma-informed hat on. The reason why kids are seeking so much control over their environment through defiance or oppositionality. Again, thinking about trauma, the big thing that happens is that sense of control is lost. And so kids do what they can to get that back. Again, helping caregivers understand this perspective can help them take that, belly breath before they respond to that kiddo. Okay, so just some helpful kind of language and tips to use when we're collaborating with caregivers. One would be asking permission. Would it be all right if I told you some things that have worked for other parents? Clarifying information on those needs, around those gaps. What do you know about coping skills? So probably caregivers have tried a lot of stuff before. And so let me know what you've done. Let me know what's worked. Let me know what's hadn't worked. Together, let's try and come up with a tweak or try and come up with something different, right? Is there any information that would be more helpful right now? We can use some clarifying language, makes sense to you. What else would you like to know? How does this apply to you? What do you make of this, right? We want to know their thoughts and feelings here. Okay, so I've got a handout for folks too that kind of goes over what I just shared. How do we work more effectively with caregivers? It has an opportunity for us as helping professionals to have some self-reflection. So what feelings are coming up for me when I'm trying to help this caregiver? What am I saying about the caregiver? How can I have that more helpful message for myself? And then some engagement strategies around providing praise, providing hope, validating your feelings, setting goals. And lastly, some teaching strategies. And again, thank you so much for putting that in the chat. Okay. So now we're going to dive into, I think, why we're all here, which is strategies for shaping that behavior. Oftentimes, I will say that when caregivers are coming to us and they're really struggling with some of these big behaviors you all mentioned at the beginning, they want to start right here. Just tell me what to do. And I completely understand that. And we do want to provide some resources and skills and strategies, but I can't highlight enough that it's so important that we engage in that first piece first before we jump in, even though it's so tempting, because I'm sure all of us are fixers and problem solvers and just want to help solve that problem. But really important to spend time understanding those caregiver thoughts and feelings and aligning with them. Okay, so I know I've shared this slide. I'm just going to share it again because it's super important. Again, thinking about as we go into these strategies for shaping behavior, just let's all remember that when we see that trauma response or when we're working with caregivers, this is really the first and only thing we can do when those really big, dysregulated 0 to 100 feelings are coming up. Okay, so I'm going to share with you this cycle for folks that were on the presentation last time. This might look familiar to you. This is called Patterson's coercive cycle. It's one of the most common behavioral cycles that occur in families, and I find it really, really helpful to understand a lot of behavior. So I'm going to go through it with you now. So the first piece is that the parent caregiver gives a command, like turn the TV off, right? The second thing that happens is that child refuses or tries to negotiate, right? Just 5 more minutes, it's almost over, just let me finish. Next thing that happens, I'm getting agitated, right? We've gone through this before, I asked you a million times, turn off the TV. It's not fair, child escalates, we're not doing this again, it's bedtime, parents escalating, child's escalating, parent escalates. You see the cycle that happens until finally someone wins, right? Either the caregiver is like, okay, whatever, just watch 5 more minutes of TV, I can't do this anymore. Or the child shuts off the TV. So neither is really a win if the caregiver just gives up and the child ends up watching that TV, or if the child does shut off the TV. What's happened is this kind of cycle has been reinforced. So I know now as a kiddo, I can get a little bit more time with TV if I just keep pushing and pushing, right? So this cycle of conflict is being reinforced. So we're going to talk about some strategies to put in place instead of escalation that can help with some of this compliance. Okay. So we're going to start with this idea of positive relationships and building up that piggy bank and building up these positive experiences and relationship through reinforcement. So I want to check in with you guys. Why do you think we start here? You guys mentioned all these big behaviors, hitting, lying, aggression, defiance. And here I am recommending, let's start with positive relationships. So why do you think we might start here with building up the relationship? So it's foundational. It helps build that rapport and that trust to disrupt the pattern. This foundation, so I'm seeing this theme here, that there needs to be trust. They might be more willing to listen. Absolutely. So thank you so much for that comment. So much of the research shows, I think this is one of the strongest research findings we have, that children will respond to discipline strategies much more effectively if there's a positive relationship. In fact, if there's nothing in that piggy bank and you're trying to take things out, it's not going to work very well, right? It's also some positive modeling. I really like that. Connection before correction. Okay, Erica, I'm going to steal that and add it to the presentation because I love it so much. Absolutely, that's what we're talking about. Like, we need to have that connection, right? And even if we think about our own lives as adults, we think about like our supervisors or our bosses, right? When we have a positive relationship with them, we end up working harder, right? And doing more. When there's that negative relationship, maybe I'm doing the minimum, right? So this is true, just I think, of human beings. So we really, really need to start, even though it sounds so counterintuitive. This parent is coming to you with this big behavior problem, and you're talking about building this relationship. It cannot be very appetizing, I think, for some caregivers. And so it's really important that, I really appreciate all your comments here, because it's really important that we understand the why so we can explain it to caregivers a little bit. And thanks for that. It's a positive discipline phase. And so a lot of the things you'll be seeing here is around positive discipline. Okay, so hopefully I've brought you into this idea that this is where we start. So now, what are some strategies? This might be familiar to folks, it might not be. When we're talking about school-age kids, I think this is such a useful tool, and it will wear itself out because it's not as helpful in adolescence. So we might as well use it when the kiddos are in a school-age range. So labeled praise is just praise that is specific, pretty simple. Labeled praise increases the behavior that it describes, it increases children's self-esteem, and it's much more effective than general praise. So instead of saying, good job, way to go, we can say you did such a good job listening when I asked you to clean the table. Really awesome job sharing with your brother, right? What happens is, especially in households after trauma, after challenging behaviors, we hear a lot of don'ts, don'ts, right? Don't run in the house, don't slam that door, don't leave the table. So it's a lot of don'ts, which we understand, but we want to balance things out with the positive as well. So with caregivers, I have them think of the behaviors they're struggling with and then try and douse that kiddo in labeled praise whenever they do the opposite. So for example, if we're working with a family where that child is really impulsive, just kind of grabbing things all over the place, I'm going to say every time that kid waits patiently, it's a party, like, wow, you did such a great job. Like, I love how you kept your hands to yourself. I love how you waited patiently, and just praise, praise, praise. And that can really help start shifting that behavior before it even gets to this kind of big problem. Again, like I mentioned, really helpful with school-age kids. It's also really helpful, I find, when there are siblings in the house. So instead of, let's say there are two kiddos at the table, one sitting quietly, one super fidgety, maybe leaving, getting up. It's really helpful, instead of saying stop that, to say, wow, Sam, I love how nicely you're sitting at that table. You did such a great job, giving all that attention to that good behavior. So not in a pathological way, in a normative way, kids want our attention, especially school-age kids, maybe not so much adolescents, but school-age kids, they definitely want caregivers' attention. And again, that's a normative thing, that's a good thing. And so we want to give our attention to those positive behaviors and take our attention away from those negative behaviors. Okay, so I wanted to give us some examples for behaviors that we see in kids who have experienced a trauma, and some examples of labeled praise that we can give to caregivers to try out. With all of these strategies, I think try out, because I think that's a helpful way to talk about it with caregivers. Here's a strategy. I'm not sure if it's going to work. I hope it does. Let's try it out. If this doesn't work, we've got a lot more tools in our toolbox. That is the kind of thing about behavior management strategies and positive parenting strategies, is that they're all not going to work, but the more tools we can build up in our toolbox, we try them out, we test them on, great, that works. It might work for a week, it might work for a month, and then it stops working, we got to try another tool. So that letting caregivers know this, I think, can be really helpful. Okay, so I'm not going to read you all these, but you can see here things like opposition or anger. How can we praise kind of the opposite of that while you're doing so well being patient? Sometimes, as you guys shared in the chat, we see that hyperactive, destructive kind of carelessness behavior. So I like the way you're being gentle with that. And then those attention-seeking, interrupting behaviors. So thank you so much for waiting patiently. Again, that seems to be a popular one. I like the way you're taking turns. All right, so thinking back to the cycle that we have, we're still in the beginning of the cycle, right? We're trying to get at the behaviors before this cycle is created. I promise we will talk about some strategies to use once we see those big behaviors. So for kids with trauma, there is a high level of emotion dysregulation that can happen, right? Because of that stress response and that HPA access and that fight, flight, freeze and this broken alarm, right? So in order for kids to be able to manage their behaviors, they need tools to calm themselves down. And again, really helpful for younger kids. So I like this quote, when little people are overwhelmed by big emotions, it's our job to share our calm, not to join in the chaos. So again, if you haven't caught on, caregivers are so important in helping to manage these behaviors for school-age kiddos. And so caregivers can help by modeling relaxation skills as well. Relaxation skills, again, when we're thinking about these big behavior problems, like this might not seem like it would be a fit for caregivers, but relaxation is so important for helping to lower that body's alarm system, to reduce that distress related to triggers. And it's potentially, or particularly, I should say, helpful for kiddos with those high re-experiencing symptoms. So we know that after trauma, children can have those intrusive thoughts and feelings. Like a lot of you mentioned, this idea of intergenerational trauma, and that caregivers themselves can be experiencing their own triggering thoughts and feelings. Using these relaxation skills, grounding skills can be really helpful for kiddos, and it's very helpful for us as caregivers as well. Okay, so I'm just going to share some examples with you, some resources here. So this one is just about grounding. For younger kids, I think this is a helpful kind of handout you can share when you're noticing some, not those big feelings, that trauma response, right? When you're noticing some of the, some challenging behavior, you know, name 3 things that you see, that you smell, that you hear, that you feel. It's kind of a fun activity caregivers can do, kids can do. You know, you're in the grocery store, you're starting to see that kiddo get squirrely in that wagon. Okay, let's name 3 things that we see, you know, so that can be really helpful, and it can kind of distract from that and help ground that child into their environment. I love this video so much. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend, although I do warn you, this song will get in your head and not be able to get out. But this is a wonderful video Sesame Street puts on. I included the link here, but you can just simply Google Sesame Street belly breaths. It'll come up for you. It's a really a fun way for kids to learn the song around belly breathing. It's very catchy, and it's a helpful, belly breaths are one of the most helpful ways to relax our body. So I see some folks here already know this video and they share it with caregivers all the time, so that's great to see. One thing I will note is that with all these strategies that we're talking about, belly breaths, grounding, any of these other relaxation tools, this is something that we have to practice when we're calm, which feels like a little bit more work, but it really takes work off the back end. So if that kiddo is yelling, hitting, you know, starting to be like really defiant, taking a belly breath in that moment might work, but the chances are pretty low that they're going to do it on their own, right? Because they're already pretty dysregulated. But the more we can practice these skills when we're calm, when they can actually be effective and we can see, hey, they work, the more likely kids are going to use them in those moments of big feelings. So again, working with caregivers to maybe try doing this once a day, even though nothing bad's going on, there's no big behaviors. How do we make time to practice this again when we can say, hey, I do feel calmer after? Because if we're going to use it the first time when we're really upset, it's not going to work, and then we're going to be like, belly breaths don't work. So again, really reinforcing this practice time. Okay. So Livia, I really like that comment, really helpful during transitions. I'm glad you brought that up. I didn't have a slide on this, but when we're thinking about kids with trauma, one thing that we know, I mentioned that sense of control is really taken away, right? And there's a lack of like that psychological safety that we feel. And so having structure, predictability, routine can be very, very helpful. One time that we noticed that is particularly hard for kids who have experienced trauma, but also just for kids with challenging behavior, kids with ADHD or chronic disorder or any other behavioral disorders, transitions can be very, very challenging for kids, right? That they're in routine and then they're transitioning, they're going somewhere new. And it could be a time where we see a lot of those big behaviors come up. So thinking about planning for those can be really, really helpful. So during transition, here's 2 things I want you to try, right? Trying to provide that structure to those transitions. So Darby, I don't have a direct link to this, but I can try to provide to Caltrans folks like a handout of this because I agree it's very, very helpful. This is a way to kind of better understand our feelings and better understand our triggers and warning signs when we're getting upset. Okay, so think about us as adults when we're at our max, when we're at 100 and someone tells us to relax, it's like not helpful. When we've reached our top, when we're at our 5, it's very, very hard for any of these skills to work, just honestly, right? I think we all know this. So what we need to do is try and catch it, catch the behavior before it reaches that 5. So this is a really fun activity you can do with kids, and I have caregivers like post it in the house, have it in places where they can see it. So you can work with kids to start to think about what are your behaviors before you get furious. So this kiddo put calm, bothered, frustrated, angry. So now we have a common language to use. We also have numbers, which can be really helpful. And then what does it look like when we feel calm? We're smiling, we're listening. What does it look like when we feel bothered? We start sighing, maybe rolling our eyes. Frustrated, we're starting to whine, maybe we're like groaning, right? So when we're at a 2 and a 3, belly breaths are going to be great. When we're at a 5, maybe not as helpful. So this is a really nice tool. Caregivers can use this language. So just doing some check-ins when you're noticing some of those squirrely behaviors. So where are we at on our 0 to 5? Oh, we're at a 2. Okay, let's do some, what should we do? Let's do some grounding exercises together. Kimberly, I just did a presentation yesterday on self-care for adults, and we did the same thing. So this is not only a tool for kiddos, but it's definitely a tool for us as well, as adults and as caregivers. Okay, so I just wanted to provide you all kids love apps. And so these are some popular relaxation apps you can use. You can give us resources. I love the Stop, Breathe, Think one. That's really a cool one for the younger kids. My first yoga can be fun. So just ways to build up fun relaxation strategies that can be helpful for kids. So feel free to share these with caregivers. All right. So we're going to be talking now about, actually, before I go on, I just want to check in with you. You guys seem to be a very savvy group. Just want to see if there's any other relaxation or feeling or grounding strategies that you all use with caregivers that you find helpful. So definitely breathing. I think that's definitely the most popular one. So just to repeat that question, are there any other skills or tools that you all use with kids and caregivers to teach relaxation and to teach grounding? You and app, I haven't heard of that one. I'll definitely look that up. So music can be so helpful. Absolutely, it can be very regulating. Breathing and hand breathing. So we talked about belly breath, which is placing your hand on your belly and feeling that diaphragmatic breathing, placing your hand on your heart. I'm glad I asked this question. You guys have great suggestions. Go Noodle videos. Oh, Go Noodle is so great. Thank you. I completely forgot about that. Go Noodle is a wonderful, they have great videos around all of these relaxation skills that are super fun for kids to do. Sensory tools, like absolutely, that can be very, very helpful for kids. That can be very calming, guided imagery stories, art, and taking a walk. So sometimes I call that the hot walk and talk. When we're having big feelings, again, we don't want to be in a trauma response. But if we're feeling like, anywhere between a 1 and a 3, taking a walk, getting outside, what we see often is that's an easier space for kids to talk about their feelings and to talk about what's going on. When they're outside, when they're walking, when they're active, they don't have to make eye contact. They can make it feel a little bit safer for kids. So I really like that idea. Lots of breathing, lots of walking. I like these, olfactory ones, smell, quick running in place, absolutely. So when working with kids with extreme anger issues, I show them how to set a 2-minute timer, punch their mattress. They get it out most of the time, they're worn out and calm, right down. I think, Kimberly, with this, I really like the fact that you provided some structure around it, that we just don't use hitting as a relaxation strategy, but that we have a timer, we have a boundary on it. I think checking in before and after can be really helpful for kids to notice how these are working, right? Kids want to know that they're doing it right and that they're getting success. So maybe checking in on your feeling before. So where are we at right now? With 3, okay, let's do, quick running in place, cosmic kids yoga, therapy through all of these great strategies. How are we doing after? I'm at a 1. All right, it really feels like mastery. It really feels like, okay, I have control over my emotions. And that can be so, so powerful for kids who have experienced a trauma to feel that sense of mastery and control. So this rating can really be helpful too, using it as a before and after tool for some of these skills. So I apologize, I can't get to all of your great examples, but I'm glad you guys are sharing and sharing them with the group. Okay. We'll just talk briefly. I know these are a lot of strategies, and I hope it's not overwhelming. I tried to provide some concrete tools that you can use with caregivers around these. But this other tool is around shaping behavior through commands, so the way that we talk to kiddos. All right, so when we're talking about commands, which is just generally like telling kids what to do, it can be helpful to think about these 3 things. So 1, we want them to be direct and specific, right? So for some kids, pick up your toys works, and that is great. For others, they might need a little bit more information. So pick up your toys and put them in the toy box, right? For kids who have experienced a trauma, sometimes what we see is some of those like executive function difficulties with attention. You can imagine if I'm a young kiddo and I'm having some of those intrusive thoughts or memories or flashbacks about that difficult thing that happened to me, it's hard to pay attention, right? It's hard to follow commands. And so having them be very direct and specific can be very helpful. Again, this is hard for us to do all the time, but if you have a family that you're working with, or if you have a kiddo who does have these attentional difficulties or is having these high intrusive thoughts, this can be a really helpful tool. So again, having it direct and specific, pick up your toys and put them in the toy box. So exactly what they need to do. We want it to be positively stated. So, how many times do I have to tell you? It's very popular to say, said it a lot, but how can we frame it positively, right? If I hear that, the likelihood of me doing that is probably pretty low. But if you state it positively, your rate of compliance is going to be a lot higher. So just Sam, please turn off the TV. Or when you're on the school bus, remember to keep your hands to yourself, right? Rather than don't fool around. And again, for kids with these attentional or intrusive issues, we want to think about giving commands one at a time. We give so many commands during the day. And so again, for kids with attention difficulties, saying like, pick your toys, put your shoes away, set the table, and then we'll have dinner. I've remembered one of those, and then the rest aren't going to be done. And then there might be some conflict. So thinking about giving commands one at a time. So Martha, I'm just going to read your comment here because I see it now. I think most parents are not respectful to their kids. Kids deserve respect as much as adults. Absolutely. So I really appreciate that comment. And what I'll try and say about that is I think sometimes when caregivers are in these homes, a trauma has occurred, there's a lot of negative feelings, there's a lot of difficulties happening, or even if a trauma hasn't occurred, there's just tons of behavior problems going on. It can be really wearing. And what we see is parents just throwing all of this things that they probably know somewhere in their head out the window, and maybe not being their best selves. And I think we see this a lot with families that are struggling, families that have a lot on their plate, single parent households that are trying to do so much. And so we can see this behavior happening. I know for me, when I see it, it's really hard. And it's hard to align with caregivers when I notice that too. And so again, spending some time being like, hey, I noticed that I'm feeling like this caregiver is so disrespectful to this kiddo. And I think everyone's right in their comments that kids do deserve respect, and they respond to respect. We all do, right? So saying things positively, using a positive tone, it can really cut off that piece of defiance. So I really appreciate you bringing that up, because it's helpful for us to think about what are our thoughts and feelings about these caregivers, how do we align with them, and then how do we help them change those behaviors so that they can be more respectful. Jocelyn, you got ahead of me. The Incredible Years book is something I do recommend as well. It's wonderful. For those of you who take notes, I have an image of it at the end as well that we can talk about. And then Carolina, I appreciate this, that parents are also triggered from their past. Absolutely. Like we've all shared, this is a really big piece, and I appreciate you all bringing it up. I didn't have slides on this, but it's so helpful to keep in mind, again, that their parents have their own traumas and their own triggers that make it hard to be respectful and only give one command and take belly breaths. So that's why that big chunk of work we talked about in the beginning on aligning and opening up and giving some time to caregivers is really helpful. So Barbara shared, what about giving choices instead of giving commands? Many children who feel out of control respond better to having a choice with parameters. Absolutely, I think that's such a great point. I know I say this a lot, but especially for kids who've experienced a trauma, one of the things that are taken away from them is that sense of control. And one of the ways we can bring back that sense of control are choices. And I love that you use the word parameters, because we don't want to just give lots of choices, because they'll take the one that we don't want them to take. So how can we create choices for kids within boundaries, right? So, okay, we've got to clean up, like you can either choose to put your toys in the toy box, or you can choose to make your bed, if that suits you as a caregiver around your rules around the house. But I think creating forced choice or limited choice can be really, really powerful, especially for kids who are oppositional or defiant. They're in control, they're choosing, right? And again, that's really important when we're thinking about kids with trauma. So Barbara, I really appreciate you bringing that up. That's really helpful. Okay. So rules are a big thing. They're really important for maintaining behavior. I think when we think about that balance, that scale that we talked about in the beginning, we see, again, that balance between limit setting and nurturing as both being really important. Structure, routine creates that sense of safety for kids. So I think just asking caregivers about the rules in their house can be really helpful. So we want, again, as always, along this theme of respect that Martha brought up, which was so great, thinking about positively stating our rules rather than just don't. How do we state them positively, like hands to self? How do we be specific about the rules? So we're going to be good in this house. That's probably hard for me to follow along with. So how do we make it more specific? How do we use our inside voices, for example? That can be a rule. One thing I see is that some caregivers have rules for everything. There's maybe 10 rules in the house, which I understand the logic behind, but we just can't have a rule for everything. It's not going to work. It also creates a kind of a negative sense. And so I like to think about 5 rules max, kind of 3 to 5, again, having them be specific as possible. Really, really limiting it to the ones that you need them to follow through on. So I just see more comments in the chat that I'll attend to. So it's easy to get overwhelmed with all the behaviors that need attention. I found it useful for caregivers to focus on one smaller behavior so you both get practice at making changes. So thank you so much, Pat. I don't even need to add these slides. You guys are just like wonderful transitions for me. So this idea of shaping behavior, right? If we're going to work on everything, you know, hitting, fighting, yelling, slamming doors, like the likelihood of all of that like being fixed or reduced is very unlikely. So to Pat's point, the most powerful way we can work on all of these behaviors that require attention are to start small and to start focused. And the reason behind that is that we want to see some success, right? If I'm asking a kiddo or a caregiver to follow through on something and it's not working out because it's too hard, it's going to be thrown out the window. That tool, that strategy is no longer going to be used, right? We need to kind of shape that and see some small successes. Hey, I was able to follow that rule. Like, I did great. So maybe we want to add some rules in that kids can follow, again, so that they see some of that mastery. And this is like, oh, I could do this. I'm not just going to like ignore it all and, because it's too hard. So I think focusing, Pat will talk about that when we get to thinking about behavior charts and behavior plans as well. Okay. So you guys might have heard of this. It's my second favorite outside of praise strategy. It's called active ignoring. It's really an excellent tool for caregivers to use to really just cut that coercive cycle off before behaviors escalates. Again, especially helpful for kids with trauma around that sense of control and this attempt to gain control. And so this is an opportunity for caregivers to kind of pick those battles. Okay, so what is active ignoring? What does it look like? Active ignoring is really having no reaction to non-harmful negative behavior. So we're not going to use active ignoring for when a kid is hurting themselves or when they're hurting others, or when kids are running away, right? We're not going to ignore those. But for things like rolling the eyes or mimicking or smirking, right? Even though those get under our skin so much, if there are big behavior problems happening, like all the ones you guys listed, this is not really what we want to spend our time around necessarily. So ignoring means 100% ignoring of the time. And this is a way, we're not to say that smirking or making nasty faces or eye rolling is acceptable, but because they're smaller behaviors, this is a strategy that can help extinguish them. So ignoring 100% of the time. So no consoling, no last minute warnings, no nonverbals, just remain calm and dispassionate. Again, not easy to do. Okay, so what does it look like? It could look like, let's give an example of a kiddo is kind of making some taunts at the dinner table, funny faces, maybe making rude comments, interrupting. Mom can let her know. I think for kids with trauma, it's sometimes helpful to let you know that you're going to be ignoring them. Other caregivers don't do that. It's really up to the caregiver what they feel is best. But in this example, mom let her know that I'm going to ignore until you stop this behavior. Maybe get up from the table, walk away, just like, an I'm not listening kind of pose. And what's going to happen? That behavior is going to get worse. So I usually get so much attention for this behavior, like what's going on? And so it's going to escalate. That's why it's not an easy strategy. But what I promise will happen is that you keep ignoring that behavior. Lena's going to get bored. This kiddo is going to get bored that no one's paying attention to this behavior. And over time, they're just going to give up, right? And so even though it's a bit of a challenging strategy to use because it takes a lot of patience, it takes a lot of regulation on the caregiver's part, actively ignoring the behavior you do not want to see until it goes away can be very helpful. As long as we let parents know that there's going to be an escalation and that you got to keep ignoring, it can be a really successful strategy. And then as soon as that kiddo stops that behavior, that's when we give our attention and we give our praise. So this can kind of be tricky only because the behavior can escalate. And if we give in when the behavior escalates, we've just reinforced that all I need to do is keep upping the ante. But if you feel like caregivers can really follow through on this, I've used this myself, it can be really helpful. With kiddos, it's a really great strategy to kind of extinguish some of those smaller, irritable, annoying behaviors. I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions on this. I kind of went over that kind of quickly. Any questions around active ignoring? I'll keep an eye out. Okay, so we finally got into the piece that probably caregivers come in for. So caregivers come in for these big behaviors, and this is really what they want to go to first. So And I understand this completely, but I think all of the strategies we've talked about before are probably the most helpful strategies we can use with challenging behavior in school-age kids. However, sometimes none of those will work, and we need more tools when the behavior has happened, right? So these are some of the strategies that we can use after that behavior has happened, or to start shaping those big behaviors. Okay, so consequences. So this is a real popular one. Some folks like it, some folks don't. But removing those privileges of kids. Again, it's a real popular one, so I just wanted to come up with some tips that we can share with caregivers. The first one is it needs to be immediate, or it won't work, which isn't always easy because we're not always at home. But especially for the younger kids in this school age group that we're talking about, if they're misbehaving at a friend's house and then 5 hours later we're giving some discipline, it's the likelihood of them putting that together is going to be really hard. That can be challenging because then we're starting to discipline in public and other places, and that can feel uncomfortable for folks. But it is really, really important that we link the consequence to the behavior as soon as possible. So that's just kind of like those good behavioral strategies. So we want the removal of privileges, if it can be, to be immediate. One big thing that I hear is taking away pro-social activities, like taking away sports, taking away parties, taking away pro-social kind of activities. One thing I will share is that for kids who have experienced a trauma, and kids just that with really big behavior problems, a lot of times there are a lot of social issues. There are a lot of relationship issues. The research shows that kids with behavior problems are the most least liked kids in their classrooms often. And so removing kids from positive social interaction isn't always the best plan. Of course, we want to make sure that maybe we can be there to supervise, or it's an activity where there are limits. It's an activity that youth or child can try and be successful at. Maybe we don't go to the whole thing, but we go to some of it. And so just kind of a word of caution from taking away those pro-social activities, especially things like sports where there is a lot of structure around, and that can be really helpful for kids with routine and kids with behavior problems. So thinking about what else we can maybe take away. So we don't want to remove everything. I've definitely heard from a caregiver, there's nothing left but the bed. Like there's nothing left I can do, right? So obviously that strategy isn't working. We need things that kids can earn, right? So one thing I like to do is make it so they can earn back things that you've taken away. So if I take away your iPad, here's what you have to do to earn it back. It's not just I take away your iPad forever and now we're in this like terrible mood. Here's what you have to do to earn it back, and kind of state those positively. So taking the phone away, electronics are a big one. We'll get into that when we talk about adolescence in a later presentation. But now for young kids too, actually, electronics are a big thing. So removing those is a real popular one, but then thinking about how are some things that they can earn that back, so that we don't just see that negative behavior until they get it, but there's some positive behavior that we see until they earn their reward back. Okay. We also want to keep the length of removal reasonable. If you say like no TV for a month, like probably not feasible. Like if there's one TV in the house and you like watching TV. So again, consistency and follow through is the most important thing with any of these strategies. If we're not consistent, it's not going to work. And so really making sure that it's reasonable. So asking caregivers, can you follow through on that? Is that going to be really hard for you? Maybe not taking away the iPad for an entire day. Maybe let's start smaller. What feels reasonable? What's something that you can follow through on? Because that's the most important point. Don't give them a phone, period. That's a whole other conversation about technology and kiddos, but I like that point. So Naomi, what about a very defined team? That is a difficult question to answer, but we will have a presentation, another presentation that I'm going to be doing later on in a different month. I forget when it's happening, but it will be on challenging child behaviors and kids with trauma who are in the teenage adolescent group, because some of these strategies are really more beneficial for younger kiddos. Okay. Oops. Okay, so this is, okay, so Barbara asked a question that shouldn't the consequences be related to whatever the behavior is? It's a really good question. I think it can be, but I also don't think it necessarily needs to be. For some kids, it might be helpful to explain why we're taking that away. For others, it might not. So I know that's probably not a very satisfying answer, a very wishy-washy answer. If you can give an example of that, I'd love to hear that. I'm trying to think through. So I think, you know, for example, taking away the iPad, the behavior is not always going to be that they can use the iPad correctly. So I think we can think about some consequences that aren't necessarily directly related to the behavior in terms of like a theme, but we always want to connect the consequence to the behavior so that kids understand why this is happening. So I'm removing the iPad because we have a rule in our house that we keep our hands to ourselves, and you broke that rule. So for this reason, I'm taking the iPad for the rest of the afternoon. So it's really clear for kids. And again, especially for kids with trauma, where there's a lot of unpredictability, maybe people haven't explained a lot of things to them, letting them know the reason why can be really helpful. Okay, this is my last skill, I promise. I know I've shared a lot, hopefully not too many tools. This is the last one we'll go over. For me, it's my favorite one. Other people have a real negative taste in their mouth from behavior plans because they haven't worked in the past, and I understand that. So I'm just gonna go over some tools that I think can be helpful to make these successful if you choose to use this tool with caregivers. So simply, you know, creating behavioral rewards are creating a clear behavioral goal, creating a behavior schedule, and creating a reward menu. And Naomi, I'll share some examples in the next couple slides. Again, the first thing we hear from caregivers is thanks, no thanks, tried this a million times before. And so maybe tweaking it in some way might be helpful, but of course you want to open up that space to hear that from caregivers. Okay. So let's talk about it through these kind of templates or examples. And I think I'll share some resources at the end, some websites where you can get some additional templates as well and kind of print them off the internet. Okay, so I really like this one. Maybe this is for an older kiddo. We're talking maybe like a 12-year-old. So we simply make a behavior chart. So the first thing really is making that goal very specific, right? So makes bed before school. We need the behavior to be something we can say, yes, they did it, no, they didn't. If it's kind of wishy-washy, like respects people, it can be kind of hard. Like, is that happening? Is that not? Is that not respect? So we really want to make it so that the easiest way to think about it is, can I say that happened or didn't happen? So things like makes the bed before school, gets dressed before 8 a.m., keep hands to themselves. So operationalize those behaviors. Then we want to think about what, you know, this could really vary. Some kids need this 5 days out of the week. Some kids, maybe you notice there are certain days that are really hard. Some kids that are going back and forth between homes, maybe there's that transition can be really challenging. We want to put something in place that first day that they get back. That can be really helpful. So this can be really flexible to the needs of the family that you're working with, or for your own home as well. And then we want to think about rewards. So we really need the rewards to be incentivizing. So I have the kiddos come up with rewards that matter to them. Some of them obviously we take off, like maybe we're not going to Disneyland every weekend, but you can pick out the movie, or you can choose a game that we want to play on game night, or you can stay up 10 minutes later, right? These are things that are intrinsically rewarding to them. Absolutely. So Naomi mentioned it depends on financial availability of the rewards. And I appreciate you say that. So I tried to make all of these things that aren't, well, I guess Sunday you have to purchase that Sunday, but there are a ton of rewards that do not need any money to them, right? Staying up 10 minutes late, choosing what we watch on TV, 10 minutes of special time with mom, you know, all of these things can be, you don't need money for. And so I think those are really helpful to think about for the families that we work with. And then this kiddo chose stickers. So It takes 8 stickers to earn picking out a movie. It takes 4 stickers to earn choosing a game. Someone mentioned before that we want to start small and we want to make sure that they can be successful. So I typically put something on here that I know they can, that I know they're good at. So for this kiddo, like he makes his bed before school all the time. So I know we're going to get some stickers there because I need him or her or they to earn this. I need this to be successful. So if it's going to be too hard, too challenging, stickers itself isn't going to fix the behavior. But if all of a sudden they're getting to choose their game and they're getting these rewards because they're doing good on their behavior chart, then I'm going to try and get as much stickers as I can. So again, that first time we use it, we want them to earn it. We want to make it easy for them. And then we can start shaping that and adding more challenging behaviors onto here. So really be mindful of adding some easy, manageable, kind of winnable behaviors in the beginning. Absolutely, they need to be attainable. Great. So what is the best age to introduce the reward system? I really like to use it with younger kids. I'll show you an example here. So even with really young kids, you can use it. So for younger kids, you can make it visual and that can be helpful. I mean, I definitely used it with 6-year-olds. We're thinking about the school age population. I've used it with 5-year-olds as well. Thinking about, again, with younger kiddos, making it visual, maybe happy faces. One piece that I really, really like with kids who really struggle to follow behaviors is giving reminders. So just because we put on here, respect other people's things, doesn't mean it's going to happen. Most likely it's still going to happen. So maybe we want it to happen not 7 times a day, but we want it to happen 3 times a day. So we want to shape that behavior down. So giving them opportunities for reminders can be helpful. It's a little bit more hard work as a caregiver. So you say, okay, Natalie, that was 1 warning. You have 2 more. That was 1 reminder. You have 2 more left. That was 2 reminders. We really want to earn those stickers. We really want to earn, you know, that choosing your seat at the dinner table. So you got 1 more chance. So giving reminders can be very, very helpful as well. Okay. Someone mentioned rewards and monetary value. So I just wanted to give some concrete examples of rewards that don't require money. So time alone, time with friends, having friends over, staying overnight with friends is a big one. Maybe that's like you reach your behavior chart like 3 weeks in a row, spending time with a parent, things like that. I see a question here, and I also want to save 5 minutes at the end for answering some questions, but thinking about refusing your medication, thinking about refusal of any kind, right? We can use a lot of these strategies. We can think about that toolbox and think, okay, which ones would match here? So if a kiddo is refusing to take that medication, one of the strategies you could try is using that as a rule. So takes medication in the morning before school, and then they can earn those rewards. That's a helpful way to start to kind of shape that. It's an interesting question. So I think using some of these behavioral strategies can be helpful. Sitting down, again, thinking about the more positive parenting discipline strategies can be helpful. What's the relationship been around the medication? Has it always been a struggle? How can we provide some choices here, right? Maybe when do you want to take your medication? Where do you want to take your medication? Maybe pick out something to take your medication in, right? So getting some context around the struggle of what's been happening around the medication, providing those choices. So really a lot of these skills can be kind of pick and choose and put together in a way that helps with a lot of this defiance, no matter what the issue is. Okay. Just to let you know, there's some handouts here. So I did include a behavior chart handout, a template, and also a planning worksheet that you can use with caregivers. So hopefully this can be helpful. It's surprising how helpful providing a template is. Caregivers are sometimes stretched to the max, so providing them with a template can really just help them actually use and try that. Okay, so these are just some resources. Alan Kasdan is one of the leaders in challenging child behaviors, and so he has a really nice website with a lot of resources on there for caregivers and for professionals. These are some recommended readings. I actually didn't include The Incredible Years, so I don't think so. Thank you so much for someone who shared that. My favorite one is Your Defiant Child by Russell Barkley. There's a new edition out. It's really great. I won't read these all. You can see them and you'll have the slides. So the project that I run here at Rady Children's Hospital is the ACTS project. If you go to our website, it's actually actsproject.org. We can put that in the chat. We also have a lot of resources on for caregivers, information about child trauma, parenting after a trauma, and thinking about caregiver trauma themselves. So maybe providing some resources. I know we talked a lot about that as a theme today, providing some resources for caregivers about their own experience with trauma and how that affects parenting. Okay, so thank you guys so much. I'm going to stop here. I do see that there's one question, and I'm sorry I didn't get to that in the time, so let me pull that up now. Bobby asked that I have a kiddo who will receive consequences such as taking away TV time, video games, iPod. However, the reward system does not seem to be working. The child will lose privileges, doesn't seem to care about them. Absolutely, that happens all the time. Instead, the child will continuously more defiant and disruptive. We discussed picking battles, but the child has been through a dozen placements to do behaviors. Okay, so thanks, Bobby. This is probably, I appreciate you taking something that's pretty challenging. I'm going to try to answer that in a couple minutes. I think we see this a lot, and it's really heartbreaking. A lot of kids with trauma have a lot of challenging behaviors. The homes that they go into aren't prepared for those, and they keep moving homes, and that really reinforces those thoughts of, okay, I'm not wanted, I'm not lovable. And if we have those challenging thoughts happening, of course, we're going to have these challenging behaviors that we see. I think some suggestions when working with caregivers is letting them, which I'm sure you have done, but letting them know about these behaviors, spending time with that caregiver, explaining why we see these behaviors. So we talked about those expectations that caregivers might have, that this child is not just a bad child, this child is not broken, but let me explain to you a little bit about the behaviors that are a problem and why these behaviors are happening, right? They're not because they don't want love, they're not because they don't want to be connected with you, but here's how trauma impacts these behaviors. So first, trying to get that trauma-informed hat on caregivers so they can be a little bit more, have a little bit more patience with some of those behaviors. I think some of the kind of tips and tricks we talked about around having kids choose those rewards, although that's not a given, one thing that's really challenging with a lot of these things that I've talked about is they'll work for a little bit of time and then they won't. And so caregivers will say nothing works, right? And so again, letting caregivers know, these are a lot of tools. Some of them might work, some of them might not, stick with me. Some of them might work and then some of them might stop working. But I promise we've got a lot here. We'll try a couple different things together. So if this hasn't worked before, let's try something else. For that kiddo, it sounds like also probably some trauma therapy would be helpful. Getting those big feelings around those trauma, around those difficult thoughts managed for them to be able to regulate their emotions can be really helpful. So hopefully a combination of different things, aligning with that caregiver, tweaking things, and creating that message of hope, like I'm sure you do so well of, can be really helpful. So hopefully those are some good tips or tricks. I realize we're at the end of our time, but if folks have any other additional questions in the last minute we have, I'm happy to try and answer those. The slides will be available to you. I hope you guys utilize the resources. I know there were a lot of them, but again, pick and choose the ones that fit for you and fit for the families that you're working with.